Hi, and welcome to the next episode of the Environmental Answers podcast. My name is Tiana Alame. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Heather Beatty. I just wanted to let you guys know that today we are really passionate about finding climate solutions that matter. Okay, Heather, so tell me what's going on with you today. I really want to learn more about what it is you guys are doing at ScopeFour Capital.
Yeah, sure. So we founded the firm because we're focused on climate solutions. And so I think a lot of investors today, they often invest in funds like Fidelity or Vanguard, and sometimes they have an ESG label and sometimes they have a climate label, but oftentimes they're not really capturing the opportunity in the energy transition and climate solutions. And they oftentimes just invest in companies that you might find in a traditional like mutual fund or in the S&P 500. And so it's not really capturing not only the trend, but it's also not really investing in companies that are solving the problem of the climate crisis. And so we launched the firm to really hone in on what exactly is the opportunity. And then we've built portfolios around public companies globally that are actually addressing this issue and growing and becoming profitable as a result of it. And so what we ultimately want to do at ScopeFour is merge the profitability and the investment opportunity with the ability to lower greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm happy to dive into that because I know that was a bit of a mouthful. So we can unpack that a little bit if you want.
We can. I would say I would want us to hop back a little bit about and just get some insight on you and like what brought you into creating this. I know you are the CEO and founder of this firm, so a little bit about your background and why this is a passion of yours.
Sure. So I've been in the investment world for almost 20 years now, a long time. I'd say about 7 years ago, a lot of our clients at the investment firm I was working at began to ask us about how we thought about the energy transition, how we were thinking about risk as it relates to climate change and all of our investment opportunities. And that led me on a journey, both personally and professionally. I began to invest my own capital in different types of strategies that are related to climate. At that company, I launched the Climate Council. And then just personally, you know me, Tiana, but to get to know me, I'm a lifelong learner. I love to read random books about a variety of different things. And I would say that, I began to read books about waste and the environment and the history of waste. There's a book called Garbology that I absolutely love. And I read a lot about industrial agriculture and some of the effects on the planet as a result of that. And I've read and learned a lot about the ocean and how it's warming and acidifying and the result of sea farming on our planet. And so all of that, the confluence of that, and then traveling to a variety of different countries where I could actually see that firsthand made me realize that there's a different way for us to build companies, to exercise capitalism that isn't as extractive to our resources, and that it's also just not a sustainable way of living. If you think about where we are today, we have almost 9 billion people in this world, this is the first time that that's ever happened. And the demand for energy and the demand for water and the demand for food just over the course of the last 50 years has grown exponentially and isn't sustainable, right? We only have a finite amount of resources to meet the demand for all the people that we have on the planet. And that's leading to climate change, right? And all the other imbalances that you've talked about on your podcast. And so ultimately, that led me down a path where I realized there's a different way to invest in some of these companies so that we're doing things in a bit of a different and more sustainable way.
So I want to level set and have 2 follow-up questions. One, could you define what you mean by like sustainable? I know that like I've talked to various people and there's like a different perspective on it. And I'm just curious about your definition of that word.
Yeah, it's a confusing word, right? It's a confusing time out there. I feel like words are defined by the user these days.
Mhm.
So I would say that sustainability in the way that I think about it and what we're really focused on is the environment, right? Because sometimes sustainability is associated with people. Like if you just, are you familiar with the term ESG?
Yeah, but you can define it.
Sure.
So what does ESG stand for?
So that's a term that I think has been utilized and in many ways butchered, especially in the investment world, and is currently under fire. And it stands for environmental, social, and governance. Those are the what the three words stand for. And it's basically, you can apply it to any company, how any company is treating the environment, how it's treating its people. So that's the social piece, right? And then what does its governance structure look like? And how is it managing itself? That's a little bit different. And that's what people have traditionally defined as sustainability. And you can, like I said, apply that to any company. That's a little bit different than how we think about sustainability or the opportunity in the energy transition, which is thinking about companies that are helping companies and countries to meet their net zero targets, right? So I'll just give you like a layperson's example. You just think about Amazon, and they've committed to net zero, and they have these really aggressive goals to lower their GHG emissions through to 2030. And you can do that by incorporating renewable energy into your life cycle and process. So that's one way to go about doing it. And so we invest, for example, in renewable energy companies like solar and wind, on and offshore wind, utility scale solar. That's one way to go about doing it. They also took a position in Rivian, which is an EV trucking company. And so you can also lower your emissions through transportation. You can do it also through buildings emissions. Actually, buildings represent 40% of global emissions. And so ways to go about lowering that, if you think about, right now I'm in Colorado and I'm freezing cold. And so you need a lot of insulation in your building, or you're going to be seeping out the hot and the cold. And so how's your insulation, or how's your smart thermostat treating that? And if it's a larger building, is there a building automation system that actually turns off lights or turns off computers as you leave the building? So there are all kinds of different ways, not just in the traditional way, to think about sustainability as it relates to a more energy efficient economy and lowering emissions, specifically as it relates to climate.
Oh, that's clear. I really appreciate you breaking it down and gaining that perspective. I'm very curious about like this nexus between like sustainability and investment, because I know like a lot of people are like, okay, where should I invest so I avoid terms or issues like greenwashing, and better understanding that. Could you also help me break apart the terminology greenwashing, just so that, you know, anyone listening in can understand that as well?
Yeah. I would say that greenwashing is not happening as much anymore. It's more green hushing. So maybe we could talk about that too. It's
Okay.
been a really interesting arc just over the course of the last 5 years, where initially all investment companies were really pushed by their investors to incorporate ESG into their process. And there were some investment companies that were very on board with that. And there are other investment companies that treated it more as a marketing exercise, and so said, okay, well, I hear that investors want that. We don't really want to change our process, but maybe we could just slap a label on it and say that that's what we're doing. And what's kind of the least amount that we have to do to call something ESG? And I think as a result of turning what could really be a set of risk parameters into a marketing exercise, that ended up turning into what's called greenwashing. And it just means that it's not real, right? It's just a marketing exercise. On the flip side, you then had what's called like a backlash, right? And there were a lot of investors that said, you're not really doing this, and you're greenwashing, and I don't agree with that, and I'm going to sue you because you're not doing what you say that you're going to do. And so the industry more recently has begun to turn where they're rebranding a lot. They're removing the letters ESG from like labeling on their strategies. And maybe they are still doing the same thing, especially for those investment companies that were always really focused on it, or that had changed into a more sustainable practice. Now they're they're maybe still doing it, but they're removing it now from their verbiage. So it's another type of marketing exercise where I'm doing something, but I don't want to say that I'm doing it as much because I don't want to offend a certain constituency of my investor base.
No, that makes sense. I appreciate you explaining that to us. Another thing that came in as a question was more about understanding where people could learn to invest their dollars, specifically if you're interested in seeing the world be more sustainable.
Yeah. So there are a couple different ways to invest. I'm just going to focus on the climate solutions part of sustainability because that's really where our expertise is. And I would say that it's a newer way to invest and think about investing. And there's a really big arc to it. So let's just say you, Tiana, have, $100,000 or $100. And you say to yourself, okay, I really care about climate change and I care about the environment and conservation, and I don't know what to do with my $100. You can look at it philanthropically, so you can donate some money to things that aren't necessarily an investment opportunity. So, for example, nature or like peatland rewetting or grassland protection or forestation. And that's more of a philanthropy exercise, and that could really help the environment. And so you could donate to an organization that's doing something like that. And then from there, there's a lot of innovation out there. Even though 2/3 of the innovation that we need is going to, 2/3 of the innovation that we need, we already have to solve this problem. We still have 1/3 of innovation to tackle to really solve things. So, for example, the blue economy is a really big topic in a lot of impact circles. And there's a lot going on, for example, with aquaculture and fishing, what I just mentioned before, and capturing carbon from the ocean. But it's still really nascent. It's still really new. So you could invest, for example, in a venture capital fund that is investing in innovation. And let's just say, because that's a little bit more risky, that you want to put maybe 5 to 10% of your dollars into something like that.
No, that makes sense. I would say that would definitely be helpful. Another question that we got in had to be more about, have you seen like sustainability investing pay off? I know you mentioned earlier that you had traveled to different places, and have you seen that like anywhere that you've gone in the world?
Yes, and let me just finish the $100.
No, I thought you were done. My bad. I didn't know you weren't finished. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to explain it as an arc, right?
Okay.
So it's like you have $100, but you don't want to put all of your $100 into one basket. So you want to put some into venture capital. You maybe want to donate some of it. And then if you do invest in public markets, which is what we do, i.e. the stock market, then you just want to kind of look under the hood a little bit. So to see what types of companies are in their portfolio. And I would suggest investing in a climate solutions oriented strategy, because otherwise they look just like every other strategy, especially in like the public markets. And so that's, I think, a good way to avoid greenwashing, is to say, okay, are these companies actually trying to solve climate change by growing? Would it be helpful to give an example of that? Or
yeah, I think it would be helpful.
So there's a company. So we already talked about renewable energy. We talked a little bit about building energy efficiency. There's a company in our portfolio called Hitachi, which is a Japanese company that most people don't think of as like a climate solutions oriented company. But they have a huge portfolio in their research and development program of about $8 billion that are dedicated to climate innovation. And so they're doing things like drone afforestation, meaning there are drones that are actually planting trees rather than people. So very cool on the innovation front. They're also doing things like wind blade recycling. I don't know if you know anything about wind power, but after obviously they have a finite shelf life. And so when they get
with the wind afterwards,
they literally just bury them in the ground a lot. So there are all these wind blades that are buried in the desert.
I didn't know that. I know I saw some where they were using them, I guess, like as a bus stops, like finding ways to use the windmills in an alternative way, but I didn't know that they were burying 'em. We're still doing things like dilution is the solution when it's not. I didn't know that.
I know I have to tell you, since I started in this business, like at least once a month, I learn something and I say to myself, wow, I did not know that. And that was definitely one of them. When you talk about waste, you're like, why are they burying these things? They're huge.
Hmm.
So, that's a great example of a climate solution where all of these wind blades and all of these solar panels are creating a ridiculous amount of waste and toxicity. And so we don't want to replace oil and gas with something else that has its own set of issues.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I know that on future episodes, we're going to have the opportunity to connect with people that are actually working on those solutions for like recycling and like what does that actually mean? So, like you tapping on the issue of how do we deal with investing in the cycle for like once we invest in renewable energy, how do we ensure that these materials that we're using aren't becoming another problem, like another issue that we're dealing with, which then is like kind of like pushing us back and reducing like the energy that we're putting into that investment.
Yeah, there's a really great book on that I would recommend to you and any of the readers. It's called Under a White Sky.
You said
Um,
under wide?
Under a White
Okay,
Sky.
white sky. Mhm.
And she also wrote, the author wrote The Sixth Extinction. But this particular book is about all of the unintended consequences of trying to solve environmental problems.
Oh,
And it's
that would
just
be a
really
really great.
interesting.
Something that Maddie and I talked about, Maddie, who was on the second episode, spoke about was the fact that Environmental Answers could have a book club, and I think that that would be a great book that we could all like maybe engage in because I haven't had the opportunity. So, what's the author's name?
Um, it's it's Elizabeth. Let me just make sure I have the last
Mhm.
name right.
There's like under
Um, it's Under a White Sky,
sky.
Elizabeth Colbert, or
Colbert.
Kolbert, and it's a really phenomenal book.
Colbert. Okay. No, all
Um,
right. Definitely put that on the list of something because I think that you and I had talked about like the fact that there's like these trade-offs to like with every
yes.
progressive step that we make towards being more sustainable or more climate ready, unfortunately there might be things that we haven't saw yet, and that's the room for more innovation. Another follow-up question that came to my head was that you talked about the fact that we have two-thirds of the solutions that we need to be able to get to, but could you talk a little bit more about like that one third in innovation and like the perspective on that?
Um, sure. It's interesting because I am more focused on the two-thirds piece.
Okay, we
The
can talk about that.
We could talk about both, and I now wish I had like I have this chart that shows what's called the hype curve, right? And
Okay.
so there are all these different technologies that we're investing in right now that may or may not ever see the light of day. So, like a great example of an innovation that could materialize over the course of the next 10, 15 years is nuclear fusion. And I was just recently at a dinner party with a guy who is focused on that, and it requires a ton of investment, and it's not clear, right, when we'll be able to bring that to market. But if we are able to commercialize nuclear fusion, it could solve all of our energy problems. I think the problem right now is that it costs more energy to create it than to produce it, and so it's not economically viable. So that's one really interesting example. There's a lot of AI coming out right now on the innovation front. So, for example, oceans require a ton of data, right, to figure out what's going on from a warming perspective, from an acidification perspective. And there are all these entities globally that's collecting the data, but they're not syncing the data together in a way that's readable in a fast manner, right? So all of this data is now coming out. These buoys are floating in the water, and then the scientists are getting it, and they're trying to sync the data, and that could sometimes it requires deep expertise, and it takes a really long time. So that's one way to apply AI um, to solving the climate crisis and conservation from like an
Because the
innovation
AI could
perspective.
be able to, like, kinda go through the large amounts of data and then help us draw some conclusions together for this purpose versus man-hours
Exactly. Yeah,
or
exactly.
person-hours.
Yeah, woman hours. So
Woman-hours,
it's
person-hours,
woman hours. Yeah. Yeah, so that's
just
super
woman-hours, okay.
interesting. There's really, I don't know if you talked at all about AI, but it's kind of a like a double-edged sword because it requires so much water and power. And
Yeah,
so I know just recently there's a new form that came out that will require less water and power. But just in general, I do think that we should be thinking about that because the spike in energy and water is going to go up dramatically. And we just don't have the infrastructure to support that right now. And
yeah,
so, it's like there's another implication on our environment as we take on all of these new innovations. And I think that we should be thinking about that and considering it. And so that
yeah,
that is something that we invest in, and there's a lot of innovation around that too.
yeah, and when you say the energy and water, I think about, I haven't talked about AI specifically on the podcast yet, but that's something that I definitely would love to explore. I know that there's different like computer languages, like Rust, for example, is like I guess one that's supposed to use less energy
Yes.
and less data space. So like understanding like us figuring out how to train people maybe in different computer languages can also reduce our energy and understanding that as we continue to progress, there's going to be shifts and things like that.
Yeah, and what's been really interesting to see is that there are there are liquid coolants and different types of coolants that will help with that power drain and will help with the heat, even with the lower amount of energy that's being produced.
No, that makes sense. So like when we were thinking about the name of your particular episode, I was thinking about like sustainable retained returns playbook, like the playbook. Like a lot of this is diving deep into understanding like the infrastructure and systems that we've currently created. We need to
Mhm.
like invest in those in order to
Yes.
have like that's the secret. The secret is how are we investing in like our infrastructure? How are we investing in how we're going to power the future and stuff like that?
Mhm.
Understand that is the key point that, with everything
100%.
you're saying it's connecting. That's the key. So if you listen this far in, the playbook is centered around how are we building things, how are we powering our future and stuff like that.
I have a really good website for listeners to go to that really breaks it down, and it's a huge part of why we launched Scope4. Is it was really inspiring for me. We have a relationship with the organization itself. It's called Project Drawdown, and it's a group of scientists and academics that have identified 100 of the most impactful climate solutions that, if scaled, would solve the climate crisis. And so at the end of the day, I'm reading this. It's actually a coffee table book. It's a website. It's a whole organization. And as I began to dig into it, as I became more interested in it, I said to myself, why aren't we investing in this way? Right.
Hmm.
And it goes all the way through a variety of different solutions. Like some of the things I just shared with you aren't really an investment. They're more of a philanthropy. Some of them are a little bit more nebulous, like education for women and girls is actually one of the solutions, if you can believe it. Um, and but then there are others that can really be applied because they have an economic value. Um,
No.
and so, and it is at the end of the day our infrastructure. It's everything all along the supply chain of how everything is built and made. And
Yeah.
I will say, I feel like not a lot of people think about. They go to a restaurant, and I have been guilty of this too until recently launching Scope4. We never really think about where anything is coming from, right? We just sit down at a restaurant and we're like, okay, great, there's a chicken sitting here. I'm not really thinking about where my fork is coming from or my plate or my glass or where this table came from and all of the energy that was required to get all of these items here and then where it's going to go, right? Where is it going from here from a waste perspective? And so investing in things that will allow for less energy intensity, I think will help solve this problem and will allow us to keep growing and living the abundant lives that we already have. It doesn't have to be that we're foregoing something, right? I think it's just about the way that the inefficient way that things arrive at our tables and in our homes, and how can we make it more efficient?
Oh, that makes sense. I would say like one of the taglines that we use at Environmental Answers is like creating innovative systems for resilience in our built environment. So that includes all of the systems, all of the spaces that we're engaging in order for us to be more efficient. So I wholeheartedly agree with that thought process. I did want to kind of like break apart this one concept that I know that you are an expert in, helping me better understand. And I'm going to say it because you said philanthropy twice versus investing. So like if I'm someone coming to the space and I'm thinking about like, okay, I want something to change, right? I think a lot of it deals with investing, deals with like returns as far as like the economy. And then philanthropy is more so, could you break that apart for me so I can better understand it?
Just sort of conceptually, the difference between philanthropy and an investment.
Correct.
Yeah. Philanthropy, you're gonna give a nonprofit $1 and you're never gonna get that dollar back.
Okay.
And then they're going to think about how they want to invest based on um, their mission, right? So they might say, okay, so you say, okay, it's a World Wildlife Fund, for example, or it's National Geographic. And they say, oh, will you donate to us? And you say, yeah. Okay, here's $1 and do with it what you want. I don't expect to get that dollar back.
Right.
When you invest your dollars, you do expect to get not just your dollar back, but more dollars. You want a return on your investment, right? And so in this case, maybe you're going to give $1 and they're going to invest it in something. Like it could be in a project, like a renewable energy project, or it could be in a solar panel project, or thinking about Africa, for example. A lot of investors are focused on Africa as a huge solar hub, and they're trying to find ways to connect solar projects to the grid. And that's taking a really long time to do because most of Africa isn't set up for that. But so let's just say you give a company $1 and they invest in a solar project in Africa. Eventually, you're going to not want to get your dollar back, but they're going to say, okay, maybe you'll earn, 100%. And so you'll get $2 back. And so that's how you want to think about it. And that's how you want to think about risk when you're investing in the space is, can I afford to lose this dollar or not? And if I can't, how safe is my dollar if I give it to this investment?
No, that makes sense. I think it was important for listeners and then myself and everyone to like conceptualize when it comes to that is like when you're investing in the environment, I think there is a perception, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that it's very philanthropic. Like everything is kind of like you're putting your money out there because the return is so long. And like in order to like invest in innovation in environmental spaces, at least what I've seen, it seems like there's a shorter time for maybe like VCs to like invest in them because they want to see that it's going to bring the money back quicker. But it's harder when you're talking about this need for innovation to know how long it's going to take. When you even bring up like the grid in like Africa, for example, like it's not currently designed because it's not currently plugged in to like the interconnection pieces of like the other countries where that we would need that connection to flow so the energy can get out. So from my understanding, it sounds like environmental is a good place to invest in because there's opportunity, but that return might take longer. Is that correct?
In some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. And I think it really just depends on the vehicle. So when we talk about like the public markets and public companies, I think it doesn't necessarily need to take longer, right? So
Okay.
The place to me for public companies, right, is where you already have an innovation that's proven. So for
Right.
example, solar power is actually cheaper than oil and gas, and it takes less long to build out. And so if you were to invest in, let's just say, a renewable energy fund or a climate-oriented fund that incorporated some of these things, a lot of these public companies, they're really large and it's going to take them a long time to not be profitable, right? And so there is a little bit less risk because it's liquid, and you're not at risk of losing all of your money, right? It's just going to be more volatile, right? You could just sort of follow the stocks, and you could say, okay, I want to invest in something really traditional like the S&P 500, and then maybe I want to invest in something that's really different like climate solutions. And so sometimes the return on that will be really different, and that's just about diversifying your assets or diversifying your money into different return streams. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to take longer.
Okay. No, that's clear. And that's beautiful to know that there's opportunities there that maybe we can look at it differently than sometimes people get scared of, like, maybe my resources won't come back as quickly. But no, that's clear. So I did want to go back and circle to your travels and places where you may have seen investment dollars work out well, or things that you've seen from your experience. I know, like for me last year, well, now we're in 2025. In 2023, I got to go to like Singapore, and I was curious about like biophilic design and seeing how Singapore has been able to invest in that. So I was just curious about any of your travels, coming or previous, that you've seen the investment play out.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I would say that the Nordics and Switzerland, they both have an amazing way of incorporating sustainability into the economy. Um, I was in Copenhagen as an example, and they have a waste treatment center that they've actually turned into a ski slope. I would highly recommend checking it out, and that was pretty cool. And so they've turned waste into energy, and it's powering a lot of the city. And it's turned into a bit of a tourist attraction as well. So that was something that was really neat that I saw. And then we don't talk a lot about regenerative agriculture, different types of agriculture as a climate solution, but it is. So just a quick stat for you. 70% of our demand for water comes from agriculture, and only 1% of agriculture globally is organic. So a lot of people don't know that, and I didn't. And then one other statistic, which is 20% of our landfills are made up of food waste. So what I really appreciate about Switzerland is they have a really beautiful way of incorporating more regenerative types of agriculture into their economy, meaning it doesn't have a lot of pesticides and herbicides, and the cows aren't shoved into small spaces, and they're not eating a bunch of like GMO corn and soy. They're actually out on pasture, which can be really regenerative for the environment and create better biodiversity. And also it's better for health. And so I think it's a beautiful example of that. All over Switzerland, you see the cowbells, and to me, it's like the perfect example of regenerative agriculture.
No, I really appreciate those thoughts and insights that you've shared with us today. In closing, I just wanted to say thank you so much for bringing in this wealth of knowledge. The things that we're really desiring to do at Environmental Answers is to make it so that there's a shared understanding of what it is that we all need to make progress. And I feel like you have given us so much to digest this episode. So thank you so much, Heather, for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me on. I really appreciate you.
No, I appreciate you too. So if people want to keep in contact with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can go to ScopeFourCapital.com, and they can sign up to our newsletter, or they can email us at info@ScopeFourCapital.com.
Okay, that's perfect. Yeah, I'll definitely add that to the notes at the end. And that's all that we have for you all today. Next time we're going to be meeting up, we're going to be talking about recycling, specifically putting waste in its proper place. I'm looking forward to that episode. It is a product-based company, so getting to see like one of these things that is being invested in order to be a better climate solution. So thank you all for listening. And that's all for today.
Thank you.
Okay, it should be done now.